welcome to another episode of the Mediatwits. I'm your host, Andrew Lee, filling in for Mark Glazer. Last week, a piece in The Atlantic called A Eulogy for Twitter started a debate as to whether the service is facing difficulty, given its recent user growth numbers. Twitter recently said it has about 255 million active users. By comparison, WhatsApp has 500 million active users and Facebook has 1 billion. Some studies even have Pinterest at the same number of active users as Twitter. Yes, Pinterest. So coincidentally or not, this week marked the expiration of a 6-month Twitter stock lockup period, meaning that insiders and early investors that hold about 80% of all outstanding shares could sell their stake. And subsequently, we saw that Twitter's price dropped. Some of those are also pointing to the fact that Twitter's average quarter-over-quarter growth rate was just 7.4%. But despite the anemic user growth, ad sales are up 119% this year, bringing in about $250 million in revenue. So is looking at active users an effective measurement for Twitter's viability? In a response to the eulogy for Twitter, Will Remus at Slate said, Twitter comprises a relatively small number of public figures broadcasting their messages publicly and a somewhat larger direct audience. In that, he said that monthly active users is perhaps a crude metric at best. So this seems to be saying that Twitter is morphing back into its microblogging roots. But as a hybrid messaging and publishing platform, this can have some unexpected results. Recently, comedian and popular actor Louis C.K. recently tweeted his frustration with Twitter, saying, "What I hate about Twitter is I tweet a person, a person tweets a differing opinion, I tweet back, and then millions of people now dump on that person." This week, we're happy to be joined by Shel Israel, who is an early adopter of Twitter and is the author of the book Twitterville. We have Jeff Bercovici from Forbes, who extensively covers Twitter. And we have Felix Salmon, formerly of Reuters and a new addition to the Fusion TV network, who is probably the most Twitter-engaged user among us. So Felix, what do you make of this week's observations on Twitter? Some people say it's dying, some people say it's healthy, it's turned into something else. What do you see as its general prognosis 8 years into its existence?
So the first thing to say is that whenever a company goes public in the United States, people stop being able to talk about the company, and all they can talk about is the share price of the company, which is an entirely different thing. And so what happens is that every time the share price goes down, people say, oh no, Twitter is bad. And then every time the share price goes up, everyone says, oh, guess what? Twitter's coming back. It's great. And people wind up looking at the share price as a proxy for trying to, determine what to think about the service. So the first thing to do is let's try to ignore the share price, because the share price is only interesting to a bunch of speculators in the stock market. It's really not important.
Right.
The second thing then is to just have a look at what's happening with the service, and as and Twitter's old now. It's 8 years old. It's been around for a while. It's evolving. It will continue to evolve. People who've been on Twitter for a long time, like myself, will always start getting nostalgic for some sort of golden era, and wasn't Twitter better back when, blah, blah, blah. And that's really kind of boring as well. Change is, people don't like change, humans don't like change. Sometimes change is good, sometimes change is bad. But I do think that Twitter is just becoming embedded into the culture as a way of it's a broadcasting medium, it's a way of brands to get out there, and celebrities, and a place to have conversations in public. And yeah, there are other services where you can have conversations in private, like WhatsApp or Snapchat or something. And I don't quite understand why it's helpful to start comparing those to this, because it's a completely different thing. So I like Twitter. I still use it. I don't use it the same way I used to. If I ever, I've never used it the way I used to. These things evolve. I'm still getting used to the new Twitter.com website, and I'll get used to it more, and I might use it a bit more, a bit less, and it might be more or less amenable to power users like myself. I'm one of these people who basically just uses TweetDeck, and I have lots of columns, and I interact with people the whole time, and I have 100,000 followers, and all of this kind of stuff. I'm an outlier, And all of us here, media people are not normal, and all of us here are outliers. And if we start extrapolating from our own experience, we're going to start making big mistakes. Twitter is making a concerted effort to try and be very accessible to as many people as possible, and I hope they succeed.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned is that we are kind of outliers, and you tend to see some of the interesting uses of Twitter is like when a sports personality says, I'm going to be traded to this team, or whether it's when you wrote an article about Bitcoin or a column about Bitcoin, you're engaging with all these folks. But maybe for the long tail of users, they don't find the Twitter engagement as viscerally appealing as something like Facebook, where it's families, friends, pictures, media, things like that. And do you think it's hard for newbies or new users to kind of figure out what Twitter's about, and maybe that harder learning curve is part of it?
The median number of followers on Twitter is 1. It's important to remember this. And Twitter is putting quite a lot of effort into really providing a lot of value to people with 1 follower, or 0 followers, or 2 followers. And it's important because because it's just a sort of mathematical certainty that the vast majority of people on Twitter are not going to have large followings.
Right.
And so you need to be able to consume Twitter passively, and that's why people use hashtags. I think it's important that for the beginning of Twitter's existence, almost everyone on Twitter who was using Twitter was tweeting. And I think increasingly we're going to get away from that, and we're going to see more and more people who are using Twitter and consuming information from Twitter and using it as a second screen while they're watching TV and that kind of thing, who might not be tweeting themselves. And a lot of what you're talking about is, in terms of the learning curve, which is notoriously difficult on Twitter. People, I don't understand how to do this. I don't understand what does RT mean and all this kind of stuff. That's not important if you don't tweet.
Right, right. Shel, what do you think? How much has Twitter changed since you wrote your book, which is one of the first ones out there on Twitter, and what do you see as the prognosis?
Well, that's risky because I could wax eloquent with nostalgia and Felix would make fun of me. But what I think in terms of functionality, what has happened from my perception is that Twitter has gone from a really wonderful, almost folksy way of having conversations in brief, quick little spoonfuls to more of a broadcast mechanism. There's been a lot of talk in the last week about celebrities talking about their new birthmark removals or whatever. I don't follow them, so I'm not sure what they talk about. Twitter, like everything else, changes. Like you and I have changed, Andrew, since we met 5 years ago in Beijing. Twitter today is clearly going through a transformation. Talks of its death are, like Mark Twain would write, greatly exaggerated. And I found it very interesting that you cited a number that says that the financial growth is only 7.5%. I wish mine were 7.5%. And when you have the numbers that they're starting to have, that's really not too bad. As far as stock price goes, I completely agree with Felix. That's the modern day pari-mutuel bettors. People follow stock not as an investment anymore, but gambling that the price tonight will be higher than it was this morning. And that kind of changes the validity of it as a barometer of how a company is going. They're in a situation where you can, on one case, argue that there's a lot of competition, but I think the quality of the average user on Twitter is significantly higher than the average quality from a business perspective of users of WhatsApp. So that's my brief answer. I just wanted to say one other thing, though, that to Felix's point that all media people are outliers, it sounded like a really great title for Seth Godin's next book.
Jeff, what do you think of all this? As Shel said, Twitter's changing. But I guess one of the weird things is that Twitter, the company, can't really determine what that change is. Twitter has always been about the users coming up with these things like RT and @ symbols and things like that. Facebook can engineer its change. Twitter maybe can't. What do you think?
So I think that there's something really interesting going on right now, which is this distinction that we're starting to hear made between Twitter being more of a broadcast network and less of a social network.
Yeah.
A big question around Twitter to me is okay, Twitter clearly isn't worth the valuation the market has put on it right now. Most analysts will tell you that Twitter is overvalued. The question is, can Twitter's value come down to a place where it's rational? And to answer that, we need to know, is it an all or nothing proposition? Can Twitter, shrink to the point where it justifies its valuation without plunging all the way through the floor? And I think the reason some people think it can't do that it has to be an all or nothing proposition, is that with social networks, the network effect is so important. It's so important that you be big enough to, the bigger you get, the more valuable you become for each new user, because there's nothing more frustrating for a user to go onto a service looking for their friends or looking for the celebrities they want to follow and not be able to find them there. If you're a social network, the network effect is really important for you. If you're a broadcast network, it's not.
When you say shrink, you don't mean shrink. You just mean not grow.
I don't mean shrink in terms of the number of users. I mean the valuation will get rationalized where it comes into line with what the business can actually support.
And investors won't panic. It'll say, okay, it's back to some steady state. It's not just a condemnation of Twitter as a viable platform.
I think investors will panic at any sign that Twitter isn't becoming a universal service, as long as investors continue to think of it primarily as a social network. If you think about it as a broadcast network, then all you're saying is, well, maybe Twitter isn't ABC, maybe it's Bravo.
Right. And maybe it's this weird hybrid. Like, should you look at it more like a Tumblr, or should you look at it more like a Facebook? And maybe there is no category to put it in, and we need to change people's expectations of what that will look like financially going forward.
Sure.
Because I think the only other big platform like that, which is Blogger, was acquired by Google. I mean, is there any other standalone kind of online publishing side of things? Huffington got bought by AOL, so maybe there is nothing that's standing out there on its own.
Well, but just the way that you said, is there a standalone online publishing? That's putting it into one bucket. But yeah, it does. It stands in different buckets. But the problem with all of these new services, the only way to talk about them is in terms of metaphors, and which metaphor we choose to talk about it in has such huge implications for what we think the business model actually is and should be.
Right. So let's get to some prescriptions. Like, what if you were Twitter, or to give advice to Twitter's management, what would your advice be to them to either get that growth number up or just be comfortable where they are and just own that space?
Public.
I'm sorry, Baron.
Late for that. No, they have a problem now. They have a problem that they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to try and maximize the share price, basically. And as Jeff says, that's very dangerous, because what that means is they have to try and maximize the size of the network and keep it growing as fast as possible, even if the sensible business decision would be to say, hey, we have 250 million users. That's a lot of users. They're generating a bunch of revenue for us. We can increase the amount of revenue that we get quite substantially, even if we don't increase the number of users that we have. And so let's just build a healthy business here, and let's let the share price level out at wherever makes sense given the size of the business. But because of the dynamics of the stock market, they're not allowed to do that. They need to make these crazy Hail Mary passes in order to try and sort of back into the valuation that they have right now.
So what about Will Remus's recommendation or prediction that if Twitter's value is indeed more of a broadcast/publishing platform, so you're not making the same money off of each tweet like you would in Facebook off of each post or each kind of conversation.
That doesn't work at all.
You can't see that working. Like, let's say Shaq, or not say Shaq, let's say LeBron James is going to announce whether he's going to stay or go from his new sports team, and then Sports Authority, you can sell an ad spot on that tweet to Sports Authority or someone else. You don't see that as making up that money in any way?
No, I'm just saying that I don't think it's rational or correct to say that a broadcast network has a lower value per tweet than social network does. I think, if anything, it's the other way around.
So there is some hope of maybe selling ads at a rate that could make the investors happy with a higher revenue, even though you have a lower number of active users.
It's not low. Wait, lower than what? I mean, Twitter is always going to be smaller than Facebook. I don't understand why we're comparing it to Facebook. It's a different thing.
And I might point out that when Facebook came out, conversations just like we were having about the imminent death of Facebook, now that it's gone public, were happening. That was way back in 2013, as I recall. I guess we were all so much younger then. I very briefly said that Twitter is something in transition right now. And yes, I do think it is moving from what I love, which is where all people are media people, and that's in a conversational thing that's social, thus social media. I think Twitter, because it has gone public, needs to focus on monetization in a way they haven't been able to before. I think they also need to develop a focus articulated in a way that not only its users but its investors can understand it. And perhaps the people who have the shares now will trade it to people who take a longer view in their investments. Right now, I think it's going to continue to get battered by some wild speculation that's being catalyzed by some reports of their death and reports of their reincarnation. This is all happening very fast, and it is all very, very new, and we're looking at models that are based on history and academic looks at investment models way back in, say, 2010. The world is a very different place now.
Let me say two things. One is that the distinction between broadcast and social, I think, is less important than the distinction between US and global. I think what Twitter is becoming is that it has become a very impressive revenue generation machine in the US. It can, if you're an advertiser on a TV show, Twitter has very sophisticated ability to get you to send tweets out to all of the people who are watching that TV show and who are also, doing the second screen thing on Twitter. So that kind of technology is incredibly valuable, and they're going to be able to monetize it, and they're going to be able to monetize it in the US. But if you look at the countries with the highest rate of Twitter adoption, number one is Turkey, number two is Japan, I think, and then I think Mexico. It's not the US. And the way that Twitter is used in those countries is much more as a social network, much less as a broadcast network. And the power of Twitter globally, I think, if I'm an investor and I'm looking for some great social media, social network, this is going to take over the world play, I think I'm looking for places like Turkey rather than to America.
Jeff, what do you think? Is that, because Twitter is such a malleable thing, and because, as Felix said, it's being used in very different ways in different international locales, does it make it that much harder for Twitter to figure out what this is?
That is a really interesting point. I mean, that's something that Twitter has done from the beginning. They've tried not to necessarily define what it is, but just to put a tool out there and let people on it define what it was going to be. So I don't know that I would say that's a problem per se. It does suggest that they need a different business model in those countries, and the fact that they have been so much more successful monetizing in the U.S. suggested this is the business model that's going to work. So you would think the implication is, as they, as their international strategy matures, that there too it becomes more and more about being a broadcast model that brands and marketers can ride along on top of, and less about. I mean, although interestingly, on their last call, Twitter did emphasize, or actually on their last couple earnings calls, they did emphasize that they're trying to also beef up the personal conversations part of the service. They've taken some steps recently to make their direct messaging service a lot more visible and easier to use for people. So maybe they see a business there too. I don't know what it is. I don't think DMs are really a business for them.
Right. I mean, there was also the announcement that Amazon was trying to use Twitter as a way for folks to kind of add things to their wish list or to their shopping cart as a platform. That's kind of interesting. But are there other opportunities out there for Twitter to go beyond just, what we see it as today, to be a platform for more interesting things like Amazon?
I think Amazon would have a partnership between Twitter and Amazon has very, very interesting implications. Amazon is a company whose strategy to me is they began online. They sucked customers out of bookstores and consumer electronics stores, and now with contextual technologies and mobile technologies particularly, people aren't going home and ordering stuff. They're going everywhere, and the mobile technology is part of it. No company is looking more closely at that sort of stuff than Amazon. Amazon is starting to follow Uber and go wherever the customer's going. They've got all these home delivery programs coming. I understand there's more going on. And it is such, they can have their own social network that lets users talk about what they like, where they like, and it can, to me, that's a big promise for the future. At one time, I thought that Amazon would buy Twitter. Now I'm not so sure.
What do you folks see? Is that Amazon? Looks like a gimmick. I've never seen that video before. It looks kind of interesting as a gimmick. But I think they're trying to find any way to engage users on to get more stuff in the shopping cart as possible.
It's sort of interesting that Twitter that deal isn't revenue producing for Amazon, because so many web publishers, big and small, are making so much money from Amazon affiliate fees. I don't see why Twitter shouldn't be in that crowd too.
That's a good point. I don't know if Twitter is getting that referral fee by doing that. I would have to imagine there's something interesting going on back there.
I think they said for right now there's no revenue. This partnership doesn't generate any revenue for Twitter. Someone correct me if I'm wrong on that. But
good point. Well, so any final recommendations for Twitter? What is something they should be doing that they're not doing right now to explore, whether it's user interface or platform or partnerships?
It depends on what you mean by should, doesn't it, really? Because they, again, we come back to this whole idea of they're a public company and what they should be doing is trying to maximize the share price versus, they're a social network and what they should be doing is trying to just make happy users. And those things don't always coincide.
So here's something that nobody's really talking about, which is if Twitter's strategic thinking, if Twitter is seeing itself as more of a broadcast network, less of a social network, the implication to me is that they need to increase the quality. So if they're a cable network, or right now they're at the kind of they're at the phase in the life cycle of cable where it's a lot of reruns and cable access shows and infomercials. They need to increase the quality of what's on the platform. That's how you're going to draw new users to it, not by making the tools easier for people to use.
Right. Shell?
That's what they're doing by trying to emphasize pictures and make the more popular tweets bigger and that kind of thing with the redesign. They're trying to draw attention to the higher quality stuff and reduce attention to the lower quality stuff. That's clearly part of the strategy already.
Sure.
Shell, any last ideas?
Yeah, I guess I do wax nostalgic where in the long term the best way of making a lot of money for investors is to make customers wildly loyal to you. And I think Twitter needs to focus on cleaning up the confusion going on there. And I think making it look and feel more like Facebook is a really unwise course for them to take because they will never be the Facebook in it. I think looking too closely at short-term stock speculations is a suicide pill for a company like Twitter. And I think that they really need to articulate a long-term focus and stick to it. I looked to Facebook there where when everybody was trashing Facebook stock, Zuckerberg said he's really interested in his next billion users. And then when he showed that he had that vision by buying WhatsApp, everybody said, how could he possibly spend $19 billion there? Well, if you're trying to acquire a billion users who are going to emerge into new affluence over the next 20 years, it was a brilliant move. If you're looking at the next quarter, it wasn't. I think Twitter probably has a long-term strategy. I don't follow them as closely as Jeff or Felix do anymore, but I don't quite get what their long-term vision is anymore. So,
well, thanks for all your insights. I think you wrapped that up pretty nicely, Shel. So thanks again, Felix from Fusion, Jeff from Forbes, and Shel Israel, and also Fanny Cohen for producing the podcast. So we'll see you next week for another episode of the Mediatwits. Thanks a lot.